Part of what I was always trying to do was to emphasize the deeply contested, unstable nature and often incoherent nature of race and language, and to try to call into question, especially the categories that are available to us for naming varieties of language and the categories that are available to us for naming populations and parsing and perceiving.
Hello, and welcome back to Tomato Tomato. I am your host, as always, Talia Sherman, and I could not be more excited to bring you this episode with Professor Jonathan Rosa, who's an associate professor at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford. The soundbite you just heard was extraordinarily difficult to select for the opening intro section because this entire episode is chock full of soundbites and questions that I feel deserve to be underscored and given the opportunity to be the first thing you hear when you start listening to a podcast episode. What's drawn me to Jonathan Rosa's work for a while now is how challenging it can be for me to understand to what degree and in what ways his arguments and projects disagree with the arguments and projects of mainstream sociolinguistics and linguistic anthropology. Obviously, I think we can all agree that race and language are deeply contested, unstable, and incoherent, especially if we're talking about the relationship between race and language, in addition to interrogating the concepts of race and language themselves. But if race is incoherent and unstable, and if categories are problematic in the way they are produced and reproduced through institutional perception, then where do we start? Without uninterrogated ideas, inquiry is harder. Understanding language ideology makes less sense if the terms of the ideology you wish to interrogate are unstable. For me, this episode is about, as Jonathan says a few times, taking several steps back, saying, whoa, how did we get here? How did we get to a place where we seek to find all kinds of empirically discrete sets of linguistic features that align with certain uninterrogated ideas about which racial categories exist and in what ways? And whose interests are served by the academic work that's set on finding distinctiveness among communities' linguistic practices? So in this episode, Jonathan and I are going to talk about the potential of a raciolinguistic perspective, the problems with ontological overdetermination and academic inquiry which can reproduce the inequities and disparities it originally sought to ameliorate. And throughout, he's going to ask a lot of questions, and I, and hopefully we, are going to struggle. I don't think the questions he asks are easy or simple at all. At all. But that's the point. If we're going to talk about hierarchies of the human, which already as a statement is bone-chilling to hear, if we're going to talk about subjugation and in general just power, I invite you to struggle along with me and ask better questions than the ones we've asked before. So yes, I think this episode absolutely is exposing the failures in my own thinking, the thinking of sociolinguists and linguistic anthropologists and the academy and research for decades. But through failure, I think we get at something better. And so with that, please welcome back into your ears, Professor Jonathan Rosa. Jonathan Rosa, welcome to Tomato Tomato. Welcome to the podcast.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. You're one of my favorite academics, intellectual minds in the world right now, certainly. And so please introduce yourself. Tell everyone who you are, what you do, where you do it, what's going on.
So that's a very broad question. So I'll just share a few, practical details that can kind of help to frame our discussion. So in normative scholarly terms, I am a linguistic and sociocultural anthropologist. I am a faculty member at the Graduate School of Education and the Graduate School of Education at Stanford. And I also hold courtesy appointments in anthropology, linguistics, and comparative literature at Stanford. So I work across lots of different spaces on campus. And then I work closely with our Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity as well. So lots of different kinds of interdisciplinary dialogues are central to the work that I do. So I don't know what other details are most helpful right now, but maybe that can set some ground for us.
Yeah, I think, so you have these courtesy appointments, which I'm very interested in linguistics, anthropology, and comparative literature, but you're in the Graduate School of Education. But for context, you got a bachelor's in linguistics at Swarthmore, studying with Donna Napoli. who's been on the podcast. And then you went to Chicago to get a PhD in linguistic anthropology, where you studied with Michael Silverstein, who, besides being a giant in the field, also worked with and mentored Ben Zimmer, who was also on this podcast. So, like, other connections. And you've now gone on to publish a lot of work and do a lot of really amazing things. One thing that you did was write something on this thing called Bridging the Language Gap, where Susan Bloom also contributed to that, and she's been on the podcast. So there's like a lot of connections that you have to other people that have been on the show, but then also just many different disciplines. And so why is it that you landed in education as opposed to literally any other discipline that you've done so much work in?
So it's interesting. Actually, when I was an undergraduate student at Swarthmore College, where Donna Jo Napoli became an important mentor of mine, she was my very first linguistics professor. I took syntax with her in the fall of my sophomore year, which would be the fall of 2000. I'm dating myself now. So, I found my way into linguistics actually through education. So I was a first generation college student, and most of the people who I knew who had college degrees were my K through 12 teachers in the public schools that I attended in Western New York. And so I thought that I would become a teacher, or I could become a teacher, and that was my goal. However, at Swarthmore, you weren't allowed to major in education by itself at the time. So since then, educational studies has become a department, and I believe you can major in educational studies by itself. But at that time, you needed to combine education with a so-called, what we would colloquially call a real major. And so, you were immediately confronted with these kinds of hierarchies of disciplines and of knowledge. And friends of mine, as I was sort of thinking about what I could combine with education, friends of mine knew that I was obsessed with prescriptive orientations to language. And, a friend of mine had studied linguistics. So I was the kind of person who was deeply anxious linguistically based on the varieties of English and Spanish to and through which I was socialized, which in mainstream school settings, I was confronted with the idea that those ways of languaging were problems or were incorrect and needed to be fixed. And so I had internalized those ideas and sort of thought my job, the whole point of school is to fix my language. And by extension, my responsibility is to fix my family's language and to fix the language of people around me. So at any rate, after having internalized all of these ideas, a friend of mine sort of knew that I was really interested in these sorts of language patterns, and she was studying linguistics and encouraged me to take a course. And so that's what brought me into syntax with Donna Jo. And one of the first things you learn in a linguistics course, a formal linguistics course, is that it's a descriptive, not a prescriptive science, which is to say linguists study how people use language. They don't tell people how to use language. And by extension, the somewhat more casual way of framing that is there's no such thing as correctness. And I kind of said, if there's no such thing as correctness, then what have people been telling me in school for all of these years? And what are people telling all of these other communities and populations? And so kind of had to figure out what was going on with that. But I found that most of the questions that interested me most within, so I as a linguistics major, I studied, I took my courses in syntax and phonology and phonetics and semantics. And I found that many of the questions that interested me most were on the margins of the mainstream discipline of linguistics, even though one of the things I really appreciated at Swarthmore was as soon as you expressed an interest in language, colleagues there or faculty there like Donna Jo and others, David Harrison and others who are wonderful, they would refer to you as a linguist. And so there was this really broad orientation to what linguistics could be. However, the mainstream disciplinary project of linguistics can often be quite narrow in its orientation to language. And many of the questions that interested me most were focused on history and power and identity. And, they would often come up sort of at the end of a discussion or on the margins of different discussions within the mainstream discipline. And so, when I was encouraged I participated in a fellowship program that encouraged students from underrepresented backgrounds to consider pursuing a career in the academy and to attend graduate school. And so I needed to find a grad school program. And I thought, I don't know if linguistics makes sense because I want to study history, culture, power in relation to language. And that's, when I found linguistic anthropology. There's a introductory linguistic anthropology textbook by a colleague at UCLA, who I believe is now an emeritus professor at UCLA, Alessandro Duranti, who's sort of, legendary figure in the field. And he wrote a textbook that's just titled Linguistic Anthropology. And it's a big, thick red book. And I remember discovering it I think in my, when I was a rising junior and undergrad. And when I found it, it was like the Rosetta Stone for me. I kind of said, wait, you can pay attention to minute linguistic patterns and you can think about power and the situated nature of language use simultaneously. And so since then, linguistic anthropology has been a really important space for me. So and then the many of the questions. So I studied not just with Michael Silverstein, but Susan Gao was my primary mentor, and Michael. I work closely with Michael as well at Chicago. But Susan Gao studied, leading scholar around language ideologies and linguistic differentiation and social differentiation. So thinking about categories of difference and how they emerge and what shapes they take. And then another mentor of mine at Chicago was Keisha Fikes, who was thinking about race and racialization. So my interest in language ideologies, race, racialization, that's what informs all of these interdisciplinary commitments. And my first job was at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the Department of Anthropology there in a linguistic anthropology position. And, I had wonderful colleagues and students at UMass. Yet when the opportunity emerged at Stanford in the Graduate School of Education, which was around race and education, I thought it was a chance to kind of work in a metropolitan area, to live and work in a metropolitan space, and to branch out into education, which was, part of the foundation of my work. So initially, so yeah, in some ways I've come full circle back into education. So it's always been in the picture. It's a different kind of space though, a different scholarly space in that often anthropologists are not, in many cases, although this has shifted, I think, recently, many anthropologists have been hesitant to intervene into social situations and have felt as though, wait a second, you have to be very careful as a scholar about trying to, trying to locate yourself as someone who is an actor who should be determining social relations in a context. And perhaps, that's a fraught kind of practice. And instead, you have to think really ethically and carefully about what role you're playing in a situation versus in many applied fields like education, many versions or iterations of education are deeply applied in the senses that our work should always be intervening, or our work should always be speaking back to concrete kinds of contexts. And so it's been interesting to be in a deeply applied space, and now to kind of have that anthropological hesitance around, intervening and sort of saying, be careful about the helping hand. Often the helping hand is central to producing and reproducing the purported problem or the problem that it purports to be addressing. So anyways, I hope that gives you a sense of the broad range of conversations on the trajectory.
Yeah. And also there's kind of that irony there of anthropology having all this history of colonialism, right? And imperialism, and then kind of having that hesitancy to intervene when theoretically and like through work are very much intervening with the perception of the people that they study. So there's irony there that I think.
Well, I think that's part of that history of the discipline is part of the more contemporary, more recent sort of, concerns about ethics. Yeah. And you got a discipline that emerged alongside, in conjunction with, as central to various colonial projects, and that has served various colonial and state powers across the world, that has framed populations in ways that are used to then reproduce very particular kinds of hierarchies. And so I think there are concerns about how our work can easily lend itself to that, and a sense that we got to be really careful about, about what we're up to.
Raciolinguistics. That's your project in some sense. And it's now a huge thing. You make this term, you make this sort of perspective of raciolinguistics, and then people take it and it spawns all kinds of new discussions. And suddenly we have people saying, I think we should call it the raciolinguistic. I think that this should be more of a methodology or more of an adjective or whatever it should be. So yeah, walk us through that. You have a lot of stuff where you start this like new way of thinking about language, which is like a raciolinguistic perspective. And then you have papers that talk about undoing a raciolinguistic perspective and unsettling that raciolinguistic perspective. And you have this idea that we should unsettle a lot of what sociolinguistics has tried to do or has failed to do. So yeah, what's going on? Raciolinguistics.
So one hesitates to frame oneself as the originator of anything in these spaces
Sure.
because, we stand on shoulders of giants, and these are intergenerational kinds of
Yeah.
questions, and in some cases, ageless questions. So, I don't understand myself to have originated something, but there's something to be said for the development of different frames, and to kind of figure out how in what moments a certain frame can be helpful for asking or pursuing and engaging particular kinds of questions. And so a ratio-linguistic perspective emerged as a frame.
Yeah.
And, it's something that in some ways I had been working on in different ways, and my close colleague and collaborator Nelson Flores had been working on in some ways. And we were trying to figure out, and I mentioned one of my mentors, Keisha Fikes, a few minutes ago. And after I had the book project from a few years ago, Looking Like a Language, Sounding Like a Race, was based on my dissertation, which had the same title, which was based on my master's thesis, which had the same title. Once you create a good song, you got to keep playing that song. Is the idea. But this kind of entanglement of ideas about language and races has vexed me and interested me for some time, and continues to interest me. And often ethnolinguistics has been the received frame in sociolinguistics, and there's sort of an uninterrogated set of ideas about race and ethnicity that have made ethnicity a more comfortable category in some scholarly spaces than race. So race has often been understood as a mystification, and ethnicity has been understood as a more straightforward or unproblematic empirical kind of reference. So the idea is that ethnicity corresponds to cultural practices, or in some cases, it's a gloss for nationality. In my view, ethnicity is a deeply problematic concept, as is race. And so there was this sense that ethnolinguistics was often invoking race, but doing so in ways that didn't seriously engage with race. And so the mentor of mine that I mentioned, Keisha Fikes, at one point said to me, "Why do you keep saying ethnolinguistics, but then you're talking about race? You need to give a name to that." And so Nelson and I had been working on, writing something together. And we said, well, what should we do? What term should we use? And then we said, so if sociolinguistics emerged from social and linguistics, then racial and linguistics could be ratiolinguistic. We used it initially as an adjective, though. So we initially were using it as ratiolinguistic ideologies, and we were really interested in these entangled ideas about race and language, the history of that entanglement, and what it emerges out of, and what work it does across different contexts. It's been taken up often as a noun, but as ratiolinguistics. And what's, I think, for Nelson and me, and I'll speak for myself here, part of what I was always trying to do was to emphasize the deeply contested, unstable nature and often incoherent nature of race and language, and to try to call into question, especially the categories that are available to us for naming varieties of language, and the categories that are available to us for naming populations and parsing and perceiving. So to think about the ways that differentiations of populations and of language practices Many differentiations are in play and are made significant, some of which are named, others of which might not be named. All of that, that kind of entire problem space, that's always been what's most interesting to me. These categories of person and of population and categories that parse communication in different ways. Now, the uptake of linguistics has been interesting. Many people are using it not to emphasize the deeply unstable, contested, incoherent nature of race as a phenomenon and categories that are available for naming language varieties. Instead, the uptake has been sort of, in some situations, reproducing deeply naturalized orientations to race and language. So it's sort of this population uses this set of patterns or emanates this set of patterns. That's raciolinguistics. And I say, oh no, the whole point of this is to say we live in I have a lot, I'm sort of scandalized. I invite people to be scandalized by our ignorance about race and our ignorance about language. So we live in a world of 8 billion plus people. And you have some situations where people presume that there are 5 racial categories for parsing 8 billion people. And, I like to show in many of my introductory kind of linguistic anthropology courses representations of the world map in different ways, demographically and linguistically. There are some people who say, we have 8 major languages in the world, in a world of 8 billion, people, plus people, and we have 5 racial categories. So, what I always like to ask people is, or what I like to provocate around is, if your racial and linguistic taxonomies require ignorance of entire continents and billions of people in the world, you've got a major problem. And if you presume that entire continents correspond to a category, a racial category, you've got a major problem. It tells me what forms of difference you are and aren't attentive to. And that's what interests me in my work. I want to know what forms of difference attract attention and which forms of difference evade attention and why. Whose interest do those modes of attraction and those modes of evasion, what interests do they serve? And, so I'm deeply curious about what I understand. And I understand race as connected to, the history of modern colonialism. And I'm thinking about the ways that taxonomies of the human, that hierarchies of the human are taking shape and being transformed and renegotiated across context. And so that to me is an open-ended question. That is a question that needs to be taken up everywhere. And I worry that raciolinguistics, it often becomes this kind of US based, it works based on a set of US categories, or, we imagine that raciolinguistics is relevant in some continents, but not relevant in others. Wherever there are hierarchies of the human, that's where I have questions, and I don't care if you use the term raciolinguistic. I'm less interested in that. I'm more interested in how these hierarchies of person and of communication are taking shape in relation to one another, and with what consequences. That's what I want to know about. And so for me, a raciolinguistic perspective is a way of pursuing that line of inquiry. So, you show me the context in which that's not relevant.
Yeah. So I guess correct me if I'm wrong, but when I think that I first encounter the idea of the raciolinguistic perspective, it reminded me a lot of the way that critical race theory is not one thing. It's not a thing that you can just teach children in schools and then protest the teaching of it in schools. It's an approach to our entire world and our conception of not only political and economic institutions, but person to person interaction. There's that. But so similar to that, I think raciolinguistics, at least the way that I think conceptualizing recently, is you were trying to talk about the way that race and language are often perceived as one and the same, or co-naturalized, as you say, or the co-occurring, the co-articulation of race and language. And that's often because the perceiver of language overdetermines, you largely call it, what the significance of that language is, and the identity behind the speaker. But that was taken up, it sounds like, by, again, this sociolinguistic, linguistic, structuralist, empirical mode of thought and inquiry, where we say, okay, we're going to like prove or disprove empirically these things. We're going to talk about the literal linguistic differences between this dialect and this dialect, and therefore like the way that language actually they're sort of like, I guess, essentializing the way that like language undergirds race or ethnicity. But that's not really the intention that you had, because the intention that you had was to talk about, number one, like the preposterousness of like the way that we essentialize race so much, but then also how race and language come to be shaped as one and the same via perception and institutionalization, not necessarily the way that they fundamentally are. Was that kind of what you were trying to do?
Yeah, in many ways. So there's a brilliant edited volume that a couple colleagues put together years back that's titled Beyond Yellow English. And I don't know what the subtitle is, but it's something along the lines of Towards a Linguistic Anthropology of Asian Pacific America, something along those lines. But Adrienne Lowe and Angela Reyes co-edited this volume. And one of the things they write about in the introduction to the volume is what they call the distinctiveness paradigm in sociolinguistics, which is the idea that every population, every demographic should have a distinctive mode of communication. And the way that a population becomes legible is by documenting, and it's sociolinguists' job to document the distinctiveness of that demographic category, whether it's in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, age, fill in the blank. And Reyes and Lowe are critically oriented to that distinctiveness paradigm, precisely because Asian Americans are often framed as lacking a distinctive variety of English, which is to say, we imagine that certain populations engage in typifiable and typified speech. We imagine that Chicano English is a thing, or Mexican American English, and this is within the sort of dialectological approach to this, or thinking about varieties of English. But we could talk about this at the scale, on smaller scales and larger scales. We could talk about regional varieties and socio-regional varieties. We could talk about entire languages being typified in racialized and ethnicized ways. But often within varieties of English, which have been a focus in US based and European and global North, let's say, sociolinguistics, you have this idea that there is African American English or Black English vernacular, AAVE, this sort of thing, Chicano English, Puerto Rican Spanish, Puerto Rican English, maybe, but Chicano English, entire books, dedicated to the study of this. You have something that is projected as mainstream English, standard American English. We'll leave standard average European, the other SAE, to the side for a moment, that function as ideological glosses for whiteness, but in ways that often go deeply uninterrogated, which is, hilarious to me. And then, you have this idea that Asians lack a distinctive variety of English. And this is what Reyes and Lowe are thinking through. They're sort of saying, what if that distinctiveness paradigm, what if that, rather than thinking that there's something wrong with Asians, or that Asians are lacking a distinctive variety of English, what if we subject that paradigm itself? What if that becomes the object of scrutiny, so that we're no longer trying to document people's typified what becomes possible when your line of inquiry or the focus of your work is not on the typified features associated with a given population, but rather the ideological production, the ways that populations are imagined as having distinctive varieties or lacking them. And so for me, this is a very fraught sort of problem space, because on one level, I want to honor all of the work that that generations of sociolinguists have pursued in order to document the linguistic and communicative virtuosity and capacities of stigmatized populations and marginalized populations. So if we're talking about, what's framed as code switching across different spaces, or talking about, varieties, stigmatized varieties of English and stigmatized multilingualisms among, Latinx and African American populations, which are often overlapping in different ways and not fundamentally separate from one another. Often in sociolinguistics, this kind of affirming work, this work that seeks to document distinctive patterns and to affirm them, that work has been very meaningful for people and resonant. It was resonant for me as an undergraduate student in different moments and throughout my career to work through that research. However, we always have to ask ourselves about what questions are possible now. Do we have to keep asking those questions? Because what we've shown, so whether it's William Labov showing the logic of non-standard English, or before him, Dillard, or, subsequently like Ana Celia Zentea showing thousands of instances of Puerto Rican code switching, skillful code switching, which demonstrates knowledge of Spanish and English linguistic patterns. We have so much evidence of the systematicity of stigmatized populations' language practices, and yet the assumption that there's something wrong with those populations' practices are as strong as ever and as deeply kind of anchored as ever. And so, much like with climate change and many other sorts of predicaments that we might be confronted with, where you say to yourself, wait, what if this isn't a problem of documenting, gathering enough evidence of a phenomenon and trying to prove, to prove over and over the all of the data that demonstrate that this is a fact, that this is really happening? What if the structure of power that phenomenon is connected to, what if the structure of power is not unsettled by data? What if the structure of power is organized in relation to some other dynamics? And what questions can we ask about those dynamics? So for me, I want to honor the communicative practices that marginalized, stigmatized, colonized, racialized populations have produced out of necessity. I find those practices in many cases to be incredible and deeply meaningful and skillful. And I also want to think very carefully about the ideological production of those categories and those practices. So for me, what if rather than saying, wait a second, you have this category that is African American English, why isn't there a category of Asian American English that could be included into this sort of inventory of racialized and marginalized, whatever, ethno-racially marked language practices? What if instead we said, well, if African American language practices are overdetermined and Asian American language practices are underdetermined, what if those modes of overdetermination and underdetermination are not reflections of people's empirical practices? What if they are connected to a structure that needs populations to be framed in particular ways in order to serve very specific interests? And so what societal work does the underdetermination of Asian Americanness do? What societal work does the overdetermination of African Americanness do? That's what I'm interested in thinking about.
Great answer. I want to take that like all in step by step. Yes. Okay. So like starting with the stuff about how Asian Americans like supposedly like don't have this distinct typified way of speaking. I always think it's interesting to ask why that was ever like needed, why that ever needed to be a thing that was proven. It's the same thing with like in my sociolinguistics classes, there's always the day that we talk about how much work there's been done proving that there is like this empirically distinct way that white gay men speak. And then people ask, well, what about white gay women? And there's basically no work on that. And if there is work, it doesn't find the like empirical distinction. There isn't as much like able to like reproduce the study that finds that the same linguistic feature is stigmatized or perceived or registered as being associated with gay female speech. The same thing with gender, right? We find that like there really isn't this like actual huge chasm between the way that women and men are using language. However, gender seems to be some type of a thing that we're still talking about with language, as if like being a woman is a linguistic thing that you can do, which it can't be empirically, but it's often perceived that way. And again, yeah, with this overdetermining and underdetermining of language, Yeah, perception of all this seems to be salient, and that's like a huge theme throughout your work. But to talk about like what sociolinguists have done, I mean, yeah, we have to honor that. When William Labov, the founder of sociolinguistics in the U.S., did his fourth floor study, he went into the city, he went into New York, and he went to the store and he said, "What floor are the women's shoes on?" And they said fourth floor, and then he coded to see whether it was rhotic or not, like fourth floor or fourth floor. And he found out that, the sort of like upper class store was more rhotic and the sort of like lower class store was less rhotic. And then he figured out, oh my God, the upper class store actually pays its employees less than the lower class store. So that was really useful and has been useful for many years. But again, like, what is the right question right now? And what is the wrong question right now? And maybe the wrong question is again and again trying to prove with data people that, institutions or systems of power that will never really be persuaded via data. Like, I will probably cut this out. I'm not sure how much I want this out there, but like, I was raised in an anti-vax family and I wasn't vaccinated for many, many years of my life. And there's no data in the world that myself or the entire world can throw at people that used to be in charge of my body to tell them that that was the wrong decision because they were scared of autism. And, now I can do what I want with my injection status. But yeah, data is sometimes it's not perceived the way it is. So anyway.
But pause on that for
Yeah.
1 second. Even if you delete that, just for us in our conversation,
Yeah.
Stephen Thrasher discusses this in his book, The Viral Underclass. He talks about this very issue of vaccines and fears of autism, essentially how people's ableism is central. What people are they're willing to die.
Yes.
They're willing to subject themselves to the threat of death rather than disability. And for me, ableism, there's the approach to intersectionality that sort of thinks about identities, the sort of liberal, what I think of as a liberal or neoliberal orientation to intersectionality, which is like each of these forms of differences out there in the world, gender and race and class and ability, sexuality, and let's see how many of them we can juggle at the same time. And I'm going to try to juggle more than you can juggle, and that will make me more intersectional than you, or something like this, versus saying, wait a second, this notion of ableism in relation to autism and vaccines and the forms of vulnerability that correspond to various manifestations of disability and experiences of disability, and the forms of vulnerability that are associated with COVID, and the forms of labor, for example, that make one more or less vulnerable in relation to COVID. What if those are connected to hierarchies of the human? And so for me, thinking about those phenomena in relation to race is not an effort to juggle more intersectionally. It's to say race, disability, and vulnerability were never separate from one another in the first place, that these phenomena are all deeply interconnected, and the efforts to manage populations, or the efforts to sort of make particular ways of being in the world more acceptable or more legitimate, and the interests that those population management efforts serve, we should not be surprised that data that, I think as scholars, we want to think, oh, you sort of imagine this deeply liberal narrative around identifying some misconception, gathering enough data to disprove that misconception, and then changing the way people think. It's this rationalist sort of orientation to power. Power was never, rationality was never the point.
Yep.
Power is deeply
irrational.
Like its incoherence and inconsistency are fundamental to its everyday practice. And so to think that you're going to destabilize the practice by gathering enough data to demonstrate, what is actually going on, or, that's not what we're faced with. And so for me, this issue of the listening subject, or what I would frame in broader terms as the perceiving subject, is not just, part of the point here is that, just like with raciolinguistics, some people think that the listening subject is like someone with earphones on, or someone with some sort of device. The listening or perceiving subject is a structural position. And when I say that, what that means is that I'm interested in how collectively Asian Americans, for example, or Black Americans, or Blackness and Asianness broadly, come to be perceived, come to be imagined, and what work do those perceptions do? What work does perception do and imagination do? What in what ways does it make populations vulnerable and useful in relation to particular kinds of structures? And so there are concrete linguistic components of that, or manifestations of that, in terms of, we could talk about how an assessment, if one of my students wrote a dissertation a few years ago in a migrant and immigrant sort of receiving center where they were teaching people English, beginning English classes for newly arrived persons. And they had an intake procedure to assess people's English language abilities. That mode of an assessment procedure is a listening, is a perceiving subject, that kind of an assessment. So perceiving subjects can take many forms. They can be a technology, they can be some kind of a measurement, whether it's an assessment of some sort, or they can be interactionally, we can interactionally perform the listening subject or the perceiving subject. But I'm interested structurally in the work that it does to imagine and experience populations and communicative practices in particular ways. And for Asian Americans, it's like, oh, they're too assimilable. If Asian Americans learn English too well, learn English, so are either forever foreigners or are hyper assimilable, but are problems either way.
Yeah.
So it's either you are intergenerationally imagined as being from elsewhere and being deceptively connected to an elsewhere and committed to an elsewhere, or you've assimilated too much and become white. Either way, you're a problem. And I'm interested in that being made into a particular kind of problem. Blackness is constructed in different ways. Latinidad is constructed in different ways, where they're often framed as less assimilable. And what work does that do? Often it's connected to a political economy. And so that's why many of these questions become interconnected.
Yeah. And so does that relate somewhat as well to this idea of ontological overdetermination or raciontology? I mean, like, there's a quote that is not yours that is from one of your papers on raciontology. It says, "I came into the world imbued with the will to find a meaning in things, my spirit filled with the desire to attain to the source of the world. And then I found that I was an object in the midst of other objects." Fanon articulates a theory of race as ontological overdetermination. I feel like that's maybe connected of like, oh, you're this discrete racial category. You must be this discrete linguistic category. Yeah. Does that at all relate to ontological overdetermination?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, to me, so the quote you read is from Black Skin, White Masks, and there's a brilliant chapter, The Fact of Blackness. Of course, I'm using the translated, it's written in French, and the English translation is The Fact of Blackness. But he writes about sort of these encounters, both in his Caribbean experience and Martinique, where he's from, but also in the French context, Algeria and elsewhere. And, being confronted with the reality that he exists to other people as this object. And he says, in France, they say you sound like a book if you are understood as intelligent. When you speak, you sound like a book. In Martinique, they say you sound like a white man. And so what's interesting to me about that set of ideologies is that a book and whiteness become ontologically intertwined. And, in my work and in the work of many colleagues, what we found over and over is that for various racialized and colonized populations, regardless of the extent to which their language practices seem to correspond to a standardized norm, it's never enough. And based on many accumulation-based theory, what I call accumulation-based theories of change, which suggest if you would learn enough English, and in some cases with the word gap, if you would learn enough words, and then if you would learn enough English, and then if you would learn enough standard English, and it's never enough. No matter how much you accumulate, you can still be regarded as having an accent, as, being marked in this particular way as a problem. And I think many sociolinguists are inclined to orient to that kind of a situation empirically, to figure out what is different about your language use. What many sociolinguists and applied linguists are inclined to orient to that kind of an issue empirically, to try to document, oh, okay, these kids, we need a new classification for these kids because the majority of kids in the United States who are classified as English learners, they were born in the United States. English is a primary language that they use, and yet something is still framed as incorrect or as lacking. Their English language use is still framed as lacking, even though it's a primary language that they use. And many sociolinguists and applied linguists have given truth to that lie, have created rubrics for assessing what's wrong, and have suggested, oh, okay, what these kids lack is academic English, and that makes them long-term English learners. These categories, just like the language gap, these are fraudulent. I mean, completely fraudulent classifications that in some situations you have kids who spend the entirety of their K through 12 experience designated as English learners. And the consequences of that are relegation to remedial classrooms and preparation for inclusion into the service economy or exclusion from the formal economy altogether. So there's a deeply kind of economic consequence to these sorts of classifications. So for me, the question about ontology is, if ontologically your language practices seem to correspond to what is framed as the standardized norm, and yet there's still not enough, we need to figure out what's going on. How is it that race overdetermines our perception of your language practices as a problem? And what's it mean to be made into a particular kind of problem, as Du Bois asks, or as many have asked, or I may say there's this colonization equals thingification. My turn to state an equation: colonization equals thingification. And so, what kind of a thing does colonialism? I mean, and this is where we've got to ask some really serious questions ontologically about the relationship between these language practices, the borders that demarcate nation states, that demarcate language varieties, that demarcate populations. That's the root of what my work is trying to interrogate. How is it that we've given truth to the lie of these borders? And ontologically, what else is happening? What else could be happening or is happening that we haven't developed the capacity to understand?
There's a lot there. I want to pick up on one other thing, is that I think that I'm in this place now where the stuff that I read, sometimes I find that the argument that's most compelling is where it doesn't try to disprove what's been said. It doesn't say I'm not this because you've told. It says what if what you say is true? Then what, right? Race and language are ontologically connected. Obviously, language is not race. Race is not language. But if they're ontologically connected, what then can we do to undo that? I took a literary theory class last semester, and we read Lee Edelman's Queer Theory and the Death Drive, right? Futurist kid stuff, Queer Theory and the Death Drive. And his whole point in that piece is to say, oh, you're telling me I have a death drive because I'm a gay man and I'm not going to have children in the death drive. Okay, yeah, sure. What next? That was just a very compelling narrative to me. And I feel I've seen that echo throughout your work, is no, I'm not engaging with that question. I'm not trying to disprove you. I'm trying to go elsewhere, right?
It sounds like the clip of Azalea Banks that circulates everywhere where they say, so you make music for gays? And she says, I do. So what now?
Yeah.
She's saying, what am I supposed to sort of try to disprove that and spend my time trying to prove to you that that's a problem or something like that? But anyways, yeah, I guess I think we can ask some different questions, and for me, that's what I'm trying to surface. And I worry what I've been thinking through more recently, and I have a sabbatical during this upcoming academic year, and I'm trying to write something new, but it's still dealing with all the problems that I've been thinking through for some time. But I am deeply concerned with the kind of object that race has become. I mean, you're when you talk about sort of grappling with the consequences of being made into a particular kind of object, and not trying to spend all your energy disproving that, but trying to figure out what are the consequences of having been made into that or positioned as such. That sounds like strategic essentialism to me on some level. And lots has been written about strategic essentialism as a political strategy, a political project. So, there's something there, and I want to honor that project. And I worry about the slipperiness between strategic essentialism and naturalization. And based on my observation, as a USian person, a person who lives and works in the U.S., I worry about the ways that even in efforts to make race, to strategically essentialize race, it quickly becomes naturalized and biologized. And people have, you have the beginning of the conversation has to be that race makes no sense. So when people say Latino is not a racial category or Latinx, whatever label you want to use, when they say it's not a racial category, I say absolutely, it's not a racial category. Be careful about the grounds on which you assert that kind of an argument, though. You can assert that argument on the grounds that Latinos are not a racial category because they look all different from one another. So based on that logic, which racial category is a real racial category? With which category label do people all look the same? And again, you're telling me which differences you recognize and which differences you don't recognize based on, your notion of difference. And we could do that linguistically as well. We could figure out which modes of communication get parsed, get framed as different, and get framed as similar. I mean, even this is why that category, the category of academic English or standard English or mainstream English, you have to refuse. For me, I'm more inclined to refuse the terms of the debate, to sort of say academic English. When you say, oh, but kids have to learn English in order to become American or USian or successful. You've got to learn academic English, and they say you use academic English. How are you going to say other people don't use academic? And I say, what is this category of who have you let colonized your perspective on what is academic? Academic refers to learning. Where do you think learning happens? Do you think learning doesn't happen everywhere? Learning happens everywhere, but you have drawn out a very narrow dimension of what counts as learning, and then suggested that everything else is somehow unacademic or non-academic or outside of what's academic. Languaging is much more complex than that. And so what if we refuse those terms of the discussion? So I will not concede. I'm not interested in conceding much ground, or even, if anything, when I'm being snarky, especially snarky, it's hard not to be dismissive of this and sort of say, linguistically, you're uncurious. You're being uncurious. You're not paying attention to all of the languaging practices that defy that kind of a classification of what is academic. You've got to be kidding me. You're not paying attention. And in order to have a meaningful dialogue here, I need you to engage in a more serious way.
I want to ask more about this way that you've talked about how the documentation of reality can sometimes become the reproduction and it's a naturalization of reality, and how sometimes that happens through, at least in my mind, you might be arguing that it happens through frameworks that were intended to do the exact opposite. Like if a semiotic framework ends up naturalizing the world that it tries to describe, like what's going on there when semiotics was created with the intention that it's not naturalizing or essentializing the world. It's very much talking about like functionality, what things elicit and things like that versus what something quote unquote is. I feel like I see this a lot just like in social sciences in general, when there's like data accompanied by an subjective refutable argument that then becomes the reproduction of the reality rather than just like describing the reality. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what is going on there, both from like a methodological standpoint of how academic inquiry sometimes fringes on ascribing versus like describing, but then like how semiotics fits in there, because I was very curious about that. I'm like a huge semiotician. It's like running in my blood and my veins. I met this semiotician at Brown, Michael Berman. He's an anthropologist. And I like freaked out when I met him and he said he was doing semiotics. And since then he's been mentoring me, and he's very much changed my conception of which semioticians are the right ones to pay attention to. And I've been trying very, very hard to understand the Peircean framework. And when I heard you say on a podcast that you are critical of the Peircean framework, I was like, no way is this happening. So yes.
I think Michael Berman just had a new article come out in the Journal of Linguistic Anthropology yesterday. I believe I got a notification about it.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm interested in learning more from his work. But to answer your question about the ways that many social scientific categories, can participate in naturalizing different phenomena, this is part of the concern with the study of both race and language. I mean, this is why as a as a linguistic anthropologist, for the first few years of grad school, we weren't allowed to use the word language. You had to use the phrase denotational code,
Cool.
which is to say, often the received labels that are available for languaging are remnants of nationalist ideologies. And so we imagine that there is a language called Chinese, and we imagined that Hindi and Urdu are fundamentally separate because there's a border that has separated India and Pakistan for a few decades now. However, those communicative practices are so deeply intertwined with one another, but the border makes them seem fundamentally separate. Or Mandarin and Cantonese have all of the, there's many Chinese language varieties, but we imagine that Chinese is a language because there's a border and there's a flag that corresponds. And so often we're trafficking in nationalist ideology in the labels that we use. And so these kinds of, we could think about that at the level of language altogether. We can think about it more scientifically in terms of syntax, semantics, morphology, phonology, the breakdown of linguistics as a field, which in the US version of linguistics, remember, there are many projects of linguistics. The US version of linguistics has become an arm of computer science, right? It's deeply unfortunate in many ways. Other linguistics outside of the US, sociolinguistics prevails. And, linguistics and linguistic anthropology and sociolinguistics, ethnolinguistics and ethnographic, linguistic ethnography, they all go deeply, they're intertwined in various contexts throughout the world. In the US context, computer science, linguistics becomes linked to a particular kind of cognitivist universalism that, offers offers certain possibilities and comes with a whole range of limitations that we want to think about. So yeah, the way that categories can naturalize, I think for me with race, once you miss the incoherence of race, once you make it into a variable to be counted, then you miss racialization as a phenomenon in ways that are troublesome, and you end up paying attention. You end up thinking that the category itself is the kind of surface manifestation of the category, or some kind of an outcome is the problem that needs to be addressed, rather than the entangled phenomena that produced the category in the first place. And I think that's a major challenge. Wesley Leonard is a linguist and anthropologist who has written about, actually to come full circle in our discussion, the notion that linguistics is a descriptive, not a prescriptive science, is often, invoked to frame linguistics as a progressive kind of project.
Yes.
To sort of say that description, not prescription, means that we affirm who people are and what they do. But Wesley Leonard argues that description can become a mode of prescription, that based on how you describe what you pay attention to and what you don't pay attention to, that can prescribe what constitutes. And when you think about indigenous language contexts like those in which Wesley works, projects of revitalization often work based on the notion of who becomes a legitimate native speaker of a language. And we count the speakers of a language based on their mastery of the language, defined based on whose perspective, who gets to stipulate, and which structural patterns make you position you as someone who has mastered a language. Instead, Wesley Leonard offers a model of linguistic reclamation rather than revitalization, which is not just trying to produce so-called native speakers. That category of native is deeply troublesome and is rooted in the very colonial dynamics that, any anti-colonial linguistics would want to think very critically about. The model of the frame of reclamation for Leonard is a way of suggesting that this can't just be about increasing people's language capacities or making more speakers of a language. This has to be about challenging and redefining the relationship between communities and their cultural and communicative practices. And so really trying to think carefully about who, how people inherit those practices and steward those practices. And rather than sort of saying, have you learned these features and these forms? Have you learned how to control, this range of patterns? And so, there's a lot to be said about the ways that scholarly projects that look like documentation and look like disinterested, unbiased, empirical research are reproducing a whole range of assumptions about who people are and what's happening. And, for me, in many cases, this is not by chance. Much of this research is funded by institutions that are tethered to state projects. And so the state has a vested interest in measuring people in ways, in very particular ways, and not in other ways. And so, I worry sometimes that many colleagues are uncritical about the categories that they inherit, and they treat these phenomena that are really complex phenomena. They make them into variables, and I try to push against that in the work to sort of say there's a lot more at stake here. And, as an anthropologist, I kind of can lean on my disciplinary sort of space to say, we got to think about, a species level kind of analysis, which itself, like these taxonomies, we want to think about in all kinds of ways, like who fits into the human and who doesn't. A species level analysis and a broader kind of, asks us to pay attention to some broader scales. And when we think on really broad scales, then we might say, okay, so we're experiencing the sixth mass extinction in the history of this planet's existence, more than 4.5 billion years. Sixth mass extinction, which has emerged in the last several hundred years in relation to a very particular set of political and economic structures that have led to forms of extraction and accumulation that are incredibly destabilizing. Well, what role does social science play? Not just social science, but scholarly projects broadly. What role do those projects play in naturalizing this way of being in the world, this political economy, these structures? And in what ways does our research serve to sustain this way of organizing societies? And, I think we have an opportunity to ask other kinds of questions about how, what else might be going on, how else we might be accountable to one another and to the ecologies of which we're a part. That's something that I think our work can do when we push beyond some of these normative categories and questions.
Yeah. A lot there. Okay. So number one. Okay. Yeah. So like the idea that this is being reduced to a variable in sociolinguistics, I think that's fascinating. I have recently been on a little Bakhtin kick, and I'm beginning to think it's kind of an insult to the very like phenomenon that we're studying, which is language, which is so vastly complex and interesting and cannot really totally be contained when we reduce these things to variables, but also it is in the interest of not only the institution, but the actor within the institution, as in the professor, the academic, the researcher, whatever it may be. Even if you're researching race and language from a perspective of saying that it's ridiculous and stupid and not productive to essentialize those two, or to say that like this, racialized dialect is not less than, it still is in the interest that race as an empirically findable category exists. Like your research thrives on the fact that you can find the difference empirically between Black English and so-called white English, between the way that women are using creaky voice, between the way that men are using creaky voice, right? Which there is no difference, but like, whatever. People still think there is. I also want to say that a huge theme throughout your work has been this idea of like, don't assume this to be a category, right? So this summer I kind of was auditing, kind of, not really, on the books, Josh Babcock's whiteness in language course. And he says in like his syllabus, I believe, like we're not assuming, we're not presupposing whiteness and language as these categories that we like know to be true in some sense. Like what is whiteness? Like what is race, right? I think that's a really powerful stance to take.
Well, so first of all, Josh's work is wonderful. So a scholar who has taught me so much about racial and linguistic taxonomies in the context of Singapore and the Singaporean model of CMIO, which might be sort of the parallel to the US model of BIPOC. So Chinese, Malay, Indian, and other in the Singaporean context, which are imagined as being racially and linguistically embodied and enacted in different ways. And Josh looks at the organization of that and its consequences of that sort of a model. But yeah, this refusal to presume, I mean, there's give and take. I want to take seriously, like you were suggesting a few minutes ago, I want to take seriously, we can deconstruct these categories all day and yet they become deeply consequential for people. And so the question for me is, what mode of analysis could allow us or would allow us to take seriously the consequences of being made into that thing, of being positioned as that thing, while also refusing to concede its reality in any unmitigated sense. What frame allows us to do that complicated work? And I think that complicated work is, the goal there is not to just become an intellectual or conceptual contortionist, to just sort of say, oh, I can think in complex ways for the sake of doing so. That can be mystifying, and unproductively mystifying. The point for me is to sort of say we need to take seriously the consequences of that category being institutionalized in particular ways, but also refusing to accept the terms, the presumed terms of the category's coherence. And so for me, even when you invoke, gay men's speech, you mentioned that earlier, right? And certain kinds of typified features that are associated with this. You know, I want to think really carefully about how queerness gets constructed and enacted in different contexts, and who's regarded as gay. Whose practices, which practices. That's like, is that that's often imagined as a demographic category in some kind of self-evident way. There are many ways that experiences don't get registered in the ways that in accordance with the labels that we have available for recognizing them. And for me, the goal then is not to just improve our labels and to say, oh, we've got to create a more inclusive set of classifications for people. The goal is to interrogate the logic of labeling and of classification, and to say what interests are served by these projects of parsing language and parsing population in particular ways. That's what I want to figure out.
Yeah. I think that's actually a great place for us to go, because I think it's great when we can talk about all this stuff, like at this theoretical level, or even not at a theoretical level, but like really but I think that sometimes it's like, how do you actually do something that is right or is productive, not in really the sense of that word, because I know that you for a long time have said that you want to resist the idea that like this is like productive in some like institutionalized setting or whatever, but what perhaps are the actions and the ideas that people can take and hold that will set us up for a future in which these categories are not presumed, in which disproving them is not the goal, right?
Yeah, for me, it requires the dual work or the joint work of challenging stigmatization and challenging hierarchies as we experience them right now, while also not letting that contain or become the entirety of our effort. I want to create a situation in which we don't have to focus on inclusion as the entirety of our vision. And I think that that's what a lot of work is geared toward. It's sort of saying, oh, this new technology emerged and it excluded people based on gender, based on race. Let's make it more inclusive. Well, okay. I want to hold open some space for that. I get why. Look, you got these technologies, these automated technologies, linguistic and otherwise, that parse people, that are designed by situated actors who draw on particular norms and not others. And so the technologies are a reflection of their positionalities. And, that often is deeply racialized and gendered and class informed. All of these different dynamics inform these products. And a lot of colleagues are focused on making those technologies more inclusive. And I don't begrudge people that effort. I think that there's a contribution to be made there, while at the same time interrogating the technology, interrogating the economy of which that technology is a part, and not presuming that the exclusion was an accident. Maybe the exclusion is the point. And to try to improve the technology is to miss the point, that the conditions of possibility for the technology are exclusion. And so therefore, to try to rework it in a more inclusive way is to fundamentally miss the point. I think a lot of people, if I'm, again, the snarky snarky articulation of this and the more constructive articulation. The snarky is you're missing the point. The more constructive is to say we can ask more questions. We can ask deeper questions here. And so for me, I'm teaching in our teacher education program right now, and we have a course often in teacher education programs. This is for students who are obtaining their teacher credential and will go on to work in K through 12 schools. And often in a teacher education program, there's an equity course where you learn about all of these forms of inequity and try to develop strategies for responding to them. But my colleagues and I who teach the course, we've renamed it Beyond Equity because that effort towards equity and towards inclusion, it forecloses a whole set of questions, namely whether the thing you're being included to should exist. If your goal is inclusion, then you foreclose the opportunity to be otherwise, to do something beyond that object or that project. And so we want to take very seriously the need for resources to navigate the world as we encounter it right now. And so those inequities are serious and consequential, and we can't avoid them or ignore them or dismiss them. We've got to seek opportunities and access, while at the same time refusing for that to be the end goal. And I think about that both practically and conceptually. It's precisely my conceptual questions or conceptual insights that lead me to have that applied orientation to kind of say inclusion could never be enough. Inclusion could never be expanding these technologies to have them make them more representative. That's a project of surveillance. You want populations' experiences to be more readily measured and recognizable and included into these different sorts of projects of population management. That's dangerous. We should know better, and we should be able to do better and ask better questions now, beyond just making ourselves more legible. We should be able to ask, what political economy is that technology sustaining? And what other questions can we ask about the relationship between communication and that political economy?
Yeah. Last week, someone like a full-fledged adult, I mean, I know I'm literally an adult, but a full-fledged one, was like, oh, you study linguistics? I just took a test on like my language to see where my problems are. Like, it's literally the words she was using. It was so sad. She's like, yeah, I have too much Greek. I have a lot of upspeak. And I was like, oh my God, where do I start? Like, where do I start? Because that's a problem of like, do I start with like, actually, you don't do those things any more than men do. Do I start there? Do I start with actually, even if you did, like, there's nothing wrong with being a woman as this device is typologizing you as, right? Or do I start with like, why do you care? But that's like such a bigger question. So I appreciate that you're taking the harder route. Like I said this to you in an email, but like if you were like an empirical scientist and a structural linguist, I think that like your ideas just would be more easily and swiftly integrated into the norms of different branches of the academy by going this like semiotic route, by going this route where you don't assume what they assume. It's just, I think, harder to like really permeate what's going on.
Yeah, I would say that the only thing I would push on is this idea that there's this strict distinction between empirical researchers and conceptual or theoretical researchers, this sort of thing. For me, it's precisely because of my work with different communities and my commitment to different communities that I have to ask, that the theories that I'm developing or the conceptual frames I'm developing have to take a different shape. So it's not because I am not interested in work on the ground in concrete context. It's precisely because of my work with those contexts that I know that much more is going on there, and that the stories that are being told about those contexts don't make sense, and that the goal can't just be to demonstrate that those contexts are as good as a projected norm. I want to show you how those contexts are doing something far beyond that norm, are more interesting than that norm or that projected norm is in the first place. So the goal isn't just to sort of meet a projected bar, which is this illusory thing. It's to sort of say there's much more going on the ground, and we have to develop better tools we have to develop different insights and approaches to be accountable to what's going on in different kind of spaces, historically, contemporarily, and in relation to different futures as well. So maybe that's probably a good place to leave it in some sense.
Jonathan Rosa, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing your brilliance with the world. Thank you for doing the work that you do. I very much appreciate it.
I'm grateful for the opportunity, and thank you for all of the care that went into participating in this dialogue on all of the research that you did in preparation for it is very evident, and I'm so deeply honored by that work on your part. So yeah, and I look forward to listening to your future episodes as well. I'm a new fan.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you so much for listening to Tomato Tomato. I've been your host, Talia Sherman, shocked as ever that I get to interview such brilliant scholars like Jonathan Rosa, a professor in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford. I am so lucky to be able to do this. I want to thank you very, 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 very much for listening. It means the world to me. The episode description has all kinds of resources and articles, etc., etc. And Tomato Tomato's YouTube channel has the full-length, unedited interviews in video format for a select few episodes. So check that out. I will speak to you next time. Bye.